Association Space Power Podcast with Chief Master Sergeant Jacob Simmons.
We got like 4 of you out there.
Well, the exhibit hall did just open, Chief, so I suspect more people will be flowing in here in just a moment. Chief Simmons, thanks so much for taking time this morning.
Hey,
Welcome
thank you.
to the Space Power Podcast, SFA's exclusive podcast to talk about all things going on in and around the force. So really appreciate everyone joining us today. Thanks so much to Redwire and the team at Redwire for allowing this platform to happen and to have discussions like this. Yesterday it was phenomenal. We sat here with Lieutenant General Miller, Space Operations Command Commander, and then during the interview, General Saltzman just happened to stop in and say hello. So we had the CSO sitting up here as well, talking about probably some of the topics we're going to be talking about today. So as we start off this discussion, Chief, go ahead.
So you're telling me that I get to follow General Miller and General Saltzman. I don't think that this was planned very well. We've got to work on the logistics and timing of how we orchestrate these kinds of talks. Put me up front and let them close it out.
Copy that, Chief. Next time, I swear we'll do that.
Thank you, sir.
It really is a pleasure to have you on stage today and talking about everything that's happened in the past 5 years. You've been a champion, obviously, for the Space Force in your current role, and you've also been a member of SFA for many, many years. So in 2019, late 2019, nobody could have thought what was going to happen. And I founded the Space Force Association end of October 2019. U.S. Space Force stands up in December 2019, U.S. Space Command right afterwards. So let's talk about the last 5 years in retrospect and just get your perspective on everything that's happened.
So I'll tell you, 19 years prior to 2019, a Tech Sergeant Jacob Simmons was expecting all of this. We talked about this from the Space Commission that Donna Rumsfeld had led and said that we needed to have a focused effort on space, on the space domain, creating space professionals, and having resources and acquisition processes that were focused on space so that we would stay the preeminent superpower in space. We knew, even though we didn't have a Russia coming at us or a China coming at us, that they were watching how we were able to get after adversaries using space-enabled effects. We knew that in the year 2000 and 2001. But in 2001, we had 9/11. And 9/11 shifted a lot of that focus to getting after the cowards that are living in the caves, right? 9/11 started our global war on terror, and the resources rightfully went there. And if you recall, we had a space command in 2001 at the time. We just needed to add a new layer to it. Instead, we took a 17-year hiatus from having that focus. That didn't mean we didn't get work done. And the reason I bring that up is because I don't want people to think that space is new, that we were birthed in 2019. We were branded in 2019. But we had been doing this for decades. Now, in 2019, that is a pivotal time frame where we had Space Command, Space Force Association, all standing up and established in order to get after the new threat of great power competition. And it's fortuitous that we did that in 2019. If we had not stood up the Space Force in December 20th of 2019, Jake Simmons' opinion, we wouldn't have a Space Force. And why is that? Because right after that, we went into COVID. And all of the national and global resources went towards a pandemic. And we wouldn't be talking about standing up a service in the middle of a pandemic. So it was very fortuitous that we were able to stand it up ahead of that pandemic because we needed it. Why did we need it? Because even during the pandemic, Russia and China accelerated their counter space capabilities. They put things on orbit and they put things from the ground to get to orbit to destroy it. And if we had not stood up a service and we had not stood up a combatant command, we would be behind the 8 ball right now, trying to catch up to their counter space proliferation.
Thanks, Chief. That's a perfect perspective and historical reference. Now let's talk about the current environment. Because as you said, our potential adversaries are out there building capability and technology to basically challenge the freedom of action in the space domain. And a lot of us have taken for granted for many, many years that we have been under the belief that space is a benign environment and the success of that. Well, the fact is, space is no longer a benign environment. Space is a warfighting domain. And the $1.8 trillion economy that we expect to have here in the next 5 to 10 years, we want the U.S. partners and allies to lead that economy, and we need a strong underpinning provided by the Space Force, demonstrated by the U.S. Space Command, to ensure that freedom of action in the domain. So let's talk about the landscape and the weaponization that's happening.
So I'll go back and say that space has never been a benign environment. It was birthed literally in great power competition with Sputnik. And we were trying to get after the USSR when Sputnik launched, and then they launched the first animal, Laika. They launched the first man, they launched the first woman, and we were behind as a nation. And General Whiting will say there was a crisis of confidence in the United States, right? Because we're not supposed to be second, certainly to a communist nation. And so over the next couple of decades, we fielded capabilities meant for great power competition. We fielded defense support program to get after missile warning. We fielded defense support communication system to get after military SATCOM. We fielded GPS to make sure we could have position, navigation, and timing. We fielded ISR capabilities. All these things over the back half of the 20th century. Space is not a new warfighting domain. It is now a known warfighting domain. People recognize it as a warfighting domain. But we have been fighting through space to support our joint forces for decades. The challenge has been that most of the capabilities that we've put on orbit to do it were done in those decades, right? Between the 60s, the 70s, up through 2000. China and Russia have built their architectures since then. So they have new capabilities, and we have long-lived capabilities. And we need to accelerate and advance our capabilities. Why? Because the capabilities they've put on orbit were deliberately designed not to provide products, utilities, services, and effects that help. They put capabilities on orbit specifically to take out ours, to counter our capabilities, to level the playing field. They've put on orbit capabilities that can grapple. They've put on orbit capabilities that can nest and open and allow something that's hidden to come out, maybe even a projectile. They've put on orbit capabilities that can laze. They've put on capabilities from the ground that can launch and destroy a satellite. These are capabilities that are extremely concerning. And why are they concerning? Because you mentioned space is the underpinning of our modern way of life, not just our modern way of warfare. Certainly we could not fight the way we want to fight. Granted, we would win regardless, but we cannot fight the way we want to fight in a modern 21st century contemporary way without space. But think if we lost it for the American public. We would not be able to do point sale purchases because it's based on the timing from a GPS satellite. We would not be able to do flight for life for a grandparent in another state. We wouldn't be able to use aircraft for the most part because they wouldn't have the position, navigation, and timing. We wouldn't be able to do over-the-horizon communication. We wouldn't be able to do shipping. We thought that there was a shipping crisis during the pandemic. Shipping would stop. And that doesn't mention the fact that we wouldn't have an internet service. We wouldn't have 24 news cycle to tell us what's wrong and what's going on. And there wouldn't be a stock market to talk about because all of the financial systems would come to a halt. I remember back in 2020, and we were seeing people get into arguments over rolls of toilet paper because there wasn't enough on the shelf, and we were rationing things that were conveniences, not the things that are necessities. And we would lose necessities if we lost space. So one of the reasons that Space Force, Space Command, were established were because we could not allow those things to be at risk. Those decades prior, space was very permissive and it was predictable and somewhat peaceful. And now it's congested, contested, and it's competitive. And all of the things that we utilize space for are at risk. And our job is to make sure that those advantages, asymmetric and otherwise, are always available. And that's not just for us, that's a global concern, right? If America's prosperity falls, so goes the world.
Thanks, Chief. You talked about the threat to the environment and obviously the impact it would have on everything we do. The average American, the average citizen around the world touches space 50 times a day, and they have no idea that they do it. Every time you pick up your cell phone and start talking to somebody, you're actually using space capabilities. And so in General Whiting's keynote last night, he talked about the need for weapons in space. Let's talk about what we need to do as America, partners, and allies to get the capabilities that we need on orbit, on the ground, to ensure we have that freedom of action in the domain.
So since we said space is a warfighting domain, we also have to acknowledge that all traditional military activities now escalate up to space, right? That is something we have to be aware of, that just like land, maritime, and air, we have to assume that we have the same capabilities to defend, to deliver, and to defeat against our adversaries from that domain. Recently, there was an executive order passed that we were to establish a golden dome for America so that we could prevent things like hypersonic glide vehicles with fractional orbital bombardment weapon systems from coming and holding at risk everything we hold dear. And part of that system is a layered effect that includes space-based interceptors. That was specifically called out in the executive order. And General Whiting said, well, what do we call space-based interceptors? We call them weapons. And to make sure it's clear signal not only to the adversary, but also so that we can normalize the conversation that this is a warfighting domain, that we have to also make sure that we can defend as we do every other warfighting domain.
Perfect. As we talk about what a day without space would look like, it's been interesting. We know at SFA, one of our jobs is to help inform everybody about the criticality of the Space Force and U.S. Space Command and what you all do, because it's so very important. So we've been working with Hollywood to help try to create content and get the word out. You know, what does a Top Gun for space look like, so that we can help the American people better understand how critical the space domain is. Because we weren't born, the service wasn't born out of a known world conflict that demonstrated capabilities that we know we needed, that we could point back to say the battle for outer space. So as we're creating content, what would a day without space look like?
So let's get back to why the media is so important, right? And we're not going to talk about the Netflix show. Even though that was entertaining, it didn't depict the urgency, the sense of urgency that has now become a state of emergency for space. We have to think about not just as guardians, the culture of a guardian, the culture of a space force. We have to think about the reputation that's projected out. So if you were to close your eyes and I said, picture a Marine in your mind, you've probably got some attributes that you can recall. If I said, picture a sailor in your mind, you've probably got some attributes you can recall. Same for the Air Force, same for the Army. But if I say picture a guardian who we have not had a war in space, who many people don't know what that guardian and what space might bring to the fight, it's vague. It's not quite as honed in. Media could help us with that, right? Help us to tell the story of what does a day without space look like, and why is it so important that we have a service and a combatant command that are watching guard over that frailty, right? Our reputation is what has to precede us. If I were to think about what would I want people to picture in their minds of a guardian with their eyes closed, I would want them to think about they are always 2 to 3 steps ahead, that they are always going to outmove, They're always going to outmaneuver, and they're always going to outmatch anybody that comes up and tries to stand in front of them. I want our adversaries, and I want our joint forces, and I want our neighbors and our allies and partners. I want everybody to look at a Guardian and think that that is the pinnacle of professionalism, but is also the pinnacle of power projection. And we have to be able to tell that story in a way that our society can consume. And media and Hollywood can help us with that, because they can put out movies and they can put out stories that tell the story accurately, and in a way that will allow people to prepare. I remember when I was in school, Red Dawn came out. And you had this ragtag group of people, kids, that knew that there was a existential threat to our existence. And they were willing to pick up arms if necessary to defend that. They had that service nature, that call to service just built in. I remember we had drills where we would hide under our desks because it might protect us from a nuclear blast. I don't know how that physics was going to work, but that's what we did, because it taught us that our democracy was not guaranteed. It was threatened. And we're in that day again today. You know, we are only 25 years, 24 if we count accurately, 24 years from the Chinese Communist Party's PRC plan turns 100. 2049. So our servicemen that are in basic training today, or that are in their commissioning sources today, will be the chiefs and commanders that are on the watch when the PRC turns 100 years old. We have got to accelerate from a sense of urgency to a state of emergency and make sure that we're prepared.
Perfect. No, those are great words, Chief. Thank you for that context. It's funny, I asked General Whiting during a interview similar to this several years ago about what a vignette could be, what a storyline could be, and he answered quite similarly, of course. You know, again, advocacy is what we do here at SFA. So we recently got the Legacy Guardian Act passed in the recent NDAA, which allows people like me to be recognized as a legacy guardian so that we can help spread the word and make sure that you get all the support you need in the Space Force and that our guardians have what they need. Now, how important is it to interact with Congress and educate Congress? Because we don't have many elected officials right now who understand all the nuances associated with this space domain. We don't have the visuals necessary to see what's happening within the space domain. So how can we better educate policymakers? You've been engaged with them recently, so talk a little bit about that.
One of the things that's been the biggest advantage is the other combatant commands and the other services advocate for space. And they do it regularly. If you were to ask Admiral Paparo in Indo-PACOM what's at the top of his list of requirements, he wants to make sure that space has its capabilities to protect the fleet as it moves from our west coast through the second island chain to support any type of engagement they might have in Indo-PACOM. Because to be quite frank, China has built a C-5 ISRT system that can track our fleet all the way across the Pacific Ocean and tip and cue their systems to go after each and every one of our sailors. So the Navy is a huge proponent of space capabilities. Our soldiers are the biggest utilizer in the military of space capabilities. So they testify as to why it is so relevant and important to the soldiers that are front forward. When General Whiting goes in and testifies or has his office calls and then has his hearings, you'd be surprised. Our congressmen and women are very well educated on space, and they're looking for ways to prioritize the funding so that we can get after the biggest bang efforts that we can. But I'm very encouraged by their understanding of space. Now, what I will say is regular touch points to connect the dots matter. And that is something General Whiting and General Saltzman and many of our other senior leaders are committed to, is giving those regular touch points to Congress so that the dots are connected. On the other end, we see our guardians receiving staff delegates. right? So they come to see them in their bases, they come to see them in their operations, and they show them what they do. And those staffers go back with their eyes a little wider open. And they go back and tell their principals, you really need to go out to Schriever Space Force Base. You really need to go see Buckley Space Force Base. You need to see that we're going to get over 100 launches out of Patrick this year, and that we're going to get probably over 60 out of Vandenberg, right? You need to go see what's going on because the domain is expanding just like the universe is.
Capabilities. We've got current capabilities, the future capabilities. That we're here at the NSS floor, the 40th NSS here on the exhibit hall floor, talking to all the different commercial and industry partners on what they're creating for the future. So what are the capabilities that we need for future sustainment to ensure we have that freedom of action in the domain?
My message to industry is dream big. I know that there is a financial attribute to it, right? Hey, we need to make money, but we need to preserve and we need to propel our society as well. And our industry is in the best position to do that. They've got some of the best minds. They've got resources. They've got labs and access to academia. They can bring together those capabilities that we need to move forward. When we think about the threats that we have to get after, and we talk about hypersonics and we talk about swarms of satellites, we could be talking about the ability to laze. Well, what if we add AI and ML onto that threat, right? What if we add automation and robotics onto that threat? Because that's what the next 5 years will look like. We're going to take what the threat we see today, and we're going to amplify because of artificial intelligence, machine learning, the ability to automate those systems underneath a leadership that might not be stable. And we've got to be able to get ahead of that. I would call that a curve of consequence, that if we don't get through it before they do, then we're way behind, exponentially behind this age of aggressive advancement. I think that some of the capabilities General Whiting and Space Command would say that we need is we need to be able to move with sense of purpose, like dynamic space operations. Right? We need to be able to move without regret. We need sustained space maneuver. We need to be able to replenish and refuel our systems so that they can have more range, more lifetime. We need to have tactically responsive space options so that we can reconstitute and regenerate forces on orbit if they're lost through our launch systems. These are things that the technologies already exist for. They just got to be threaded together, right? We just need them brought together in a way that we can take them and make sure that we can defend our nation with them.
Perfect. You know, not everyone can join the Space Force, but everyone can join the Space Force Association. So if you want to find out more information about the Space Force Association, go to ussfa.org and join. Chief, I just want to say thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule over this week to talk to your SFA and tell us a little bit about what's going on at U.S. Space Command. So any final comments from you?
I think what I'd like to say is a lot has happened in 5 years. And I am super, super proud of how far the Space Force and Space Command have come in those 5 years, and Space Force Association. But here's the thing about space. Nothing, absolutely nothing in space ever stands still. Nothing in space is static. Nothing in space is status quo. It is always on the move. The challenge is now we have seen that we have actors, shooters in our arena. And just like you would in any other setting, we have the decision whether we're going to flee, whether we're going to freeze, or whether we're going to fight. I, for one, am not for the force two. We're not going to flee. We're not going to freeze. But we need everybody on board so that we can fight through this new contested domain we call space. I appreciate your time. Thanks for having me, Bill.
Thanks so much, Chief. Semper Supra.